Well, let me thank everybody. We're going to have another, I think we're going to have an outstanding panel now giving you some more of the scientific basis. I think for the four speakers that we have in this panel are sometimes unique for the academic world in that having a I guess a foot in the real world as well. So we'll hear in turn from Noel Brewer from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, from Rajiv Ramal from George Washington University, Monique Mitchell-Turner from George Washington University, and Jeff Niederdep from Cornell. And I'll just let them speak. Noel.
Here's a little advertisement to start. The hashtag for our event, as I understand it, is microbial threats. So hashtag microbial threats. Some of you have already seen tweeting, but my impression is that the organization would very much encourage you to continue doing that, and the rest of you who I've seen on devices, fire up Twitter and hashtag something. All right. I'm going to take a slightly different approach. I'm going to tell you up front what I believe, which is that risk communication is a weak intervention. It's what we do when everything else fails. It's what we do when we don't have good options. It's what we do when there's nothing else to do. So we can do risk communication, but we should be modest about our expectations for it. And that might be okay. That might be just fine. So I'm going to talk mostly from this first chapter of this book. It's free. It's available online. Lots of good information there. Practical information. It was edited by Baruch Fishoff, me, and Julie Downs. All right, so this is the gist of a model that I think describes what's in a lot of our minds, that we say something, people change what they think, and then they change their behavior, and it's all good. Let's go through that. So we can have three goals. We can just say it, and this is indeed what the FDA commonly does with their package inserts. They just say it. This is not a risk communication of any sort that any of us would recognize as things we'd want to do, and yet this is required by law. There are other things we can do for just saying it. There can be a community forum where people get together and they talk about what they know and what they don't know. And the idea is not so much to change anyone's belief, but it's the act of communicating with one another and creating community around that act of communication that can be important. So for this piece of risk communication, it might be, if that's the goal, is just to say something, it may not matter if it's effective. It might be legally required or may be socially required. So we should be clear about which of these goals we have. Are we talking about just saying it, or indeed are we trying to change risk beliefs? So here's a photograph of the filmmaker Joanna Rudnick, who tested positive for the BRCA mutation. And this is a copy of, she's looking at a mammography film here. So one question is, does risk communication change what's in people's heads? So this is an example of some data from Andy Germenkin from a few years ago. These are women with a BRCA1 or 2 mutation, and they're getting information on their risk of breast cancer. Their actual risk was a little over 25% on average. I'm a little over 20% on average. Now, what they remembered, though, was a little higher, statistically significantly higher. And then if you ask them what they thought was really true, it was actually this number right here, which is well over 40%. So what they believed was about double what they were told. That's what they really believed. Now, let me show you some of my own data from a slightly different context. Now, this is breast cancer patients with early stage breast cancer, and we can go into all the details. But what matters is that their actual risk, according to genomic testing, was here a little over 10%, about 13%. When we asked them what they remembered being told, they said about the same number. And when we asked them what they really thought was true, they gave about the same number. So the context in which you communicate risk, whether it's hypothetical, prospective, maybe in the future, versus I have a deadly disease that may kill me and this is my risk for distant recurrence, it may matter a lot. So the context of the risk communication may be particularly important. So these risk beliefs, changing risk beliefs, it's not actually that easy to do. We may want to change how likely you think the harm is to be, how severe it would be if it happened to you, how afraid you feel, or your anticipation of regret if you take a decision that ends up ending badly. Those are 4 of the key risk measures that we use as risk appraisals that we use in behavioral science. There's a bunch of others, but these are probably 4 of the most important ones. So is risk communication effective in changing these things? Sometimes, on a good day. At the end of my talk, I'll give you some examples of things we can do to increase the impact of communications in changing risk beliefs. Now here's a sign from Tom Robinson's Fish Market in Carborough, North Carolina. Tom sells good fish, or at least he used to. My husband used to drive by the sign every day. It's a pretty good sign. It threatens you. It tells you it's pretty likely to happen. So it follows a lot of good risk communication advice. Yeah, all right. Well, Tom, I'll get back to Tom here. Okay, so let me give you an example of when risk communication really worked. These are data from the flu vaccine shortage 2004-2005 from one of my studies, national probability sample of 300 adults before and after all this the shortage happened. So what I want to do is I want to point out a couple things here, and I know it's a little busy, and I'll have a couple more busy slides with apologies for that. So on the far, maybe let's go back. So on the far left here, these are people who were not at high risk. So these are the people who are at low risk and they know it. And they did not get a flu shot. Only about 5% of them got a flu shot. Well, good for them. At the far right is also accurate. These are folks who are at high risk. They believe they're at high risk. And most of them, well, a good portion of them got a flu shot, about 65%. Okay, so about a third of the sample in each of these buckets. So about 2/3 got it right. Now this error is pretty rare. These two inner bars are errors, and right here what we have is folks who are at low risk, who think they're at high risk and went on to get vaccinated as a result. What I'm worried about is this group right here. These are folks who are at high risk. They're part of the high risk population. They think they're at low risk. They didn't get vaccinated. That's a third of the population. That's a big deal, and that's a big problem. So that's a case where we have a change in risk behavior via risk beliefs. So we changed risk beliefs. We were successful for a lot of folks. However, there's some amount of failure that happened there, a large amount of failure. Now let me show you some examples, more recent examples, my trials, but we could certainly point to a lot of other behavioral science, where we changed behavior using risk communication, but this change in behavior was not via risk appraisals or risk beliefs. So this is a recently published trial in JAMA Internal Medicine, 2,000 adult smokers. These pictorial warnings were more effective at changing behaviors than again, encouraging people to quit smoking, than to attempt to quit smoking and to successfully quit smoking. They were more effective than the current Surgeon General's warning. Okay, well that's good news. That hadn't been shown before, at least with behavior. That's great. What's interesting is that these did not change any risk perceptions at all. People didn't think they were more likely to have harm happen, and they didn't think that the harm was more severe. They were more afraid, and they also could not stop thinking about these labels because it was on their cigarette pack and paired with the behavior. But this is an interesting point, that we wanted to change behavior, but we didn't do it through risk communication, through risk beliefs per se. All right, here's another example. This is some trainings that we did in North Carolina with pediatricians and family physicians and other primary care providers. This is a cohort of about 17,000 patients treated by these physicians. What happened here is that when we trained them to announce HPV vaccination, your child is 12, due for these 3 vaccines, nurse will give them at the end of the visit, we managed to increase vaccination rates by about 5.4% over a 6-month period, above and beyond secular changes in the control group. However, when we train them to have a conversation, that's not statistically significant. It didn't have an impact. And this has just been in the news a bunch, so you may have seen it. So this is a case where we certainly changed behavior, but it wasn't by the traditional means of communication. So we should be flexible about what we mean by risk communication. So this idea of changing risk behaviors is a big goal, and I think it's a really important goal. But is risk communication the best way to change risk behaviors? It may or may not be. There's lots of different things we can do. There's a really nice paper by the head of the CDC, Dr. Frieden, on the health impact pyramid that identifies policy changes as very potent ways to change behavior. And that's something that I think we should really care a lot about. I'm going to throw a little twist into all of this. This is a slightly different way of thinking about all of this, that it may be that risk communication may or may not change risk beliefs, but it may dramatically change policy support. And that change for supports like quarantine, changing the way that we regulate foods, changing the kind of vaccines that are available or how often the vaccines are given or under what conditions, those can be extremely powerful and extremely important for public health. So changing policy support may be indeed one of the most important things that we can do, whether or not we change individuals' health behaviors with risk communication. So now I promised to give you the goodies at the end, the magic. This is when we start waving our magic wand. What do you do? What is the secret of the behavioral science? Well, we don't have a lot of secrets to share with you that are universal. Indeed, it appears that risk communication and crisis communication may be different things. They may be, maybe crisis communication is a separate, a subcategory within risk communication, but it may indeed be that they're entirely different, although overlapping issues. And I know most of what I know is from the context of risk communication. Okay, so people have to understand the information, narratives, use of narratives, verbal communication, images. We saw some of that with what Angie Fagerlund presented. It has to be personally relevant. They have to take it in. They have to attend to it. Even if they push it away, having it constantly present, for example, on the cigarette packs is quite effective, even though smokers are really good at ignoring such information. People have to have a course of action, and people have to be able to act soon. If we're going to communicate in a fearful way or communicate about dangerous stuff, we need to tell them what to do. Otherwise, all of that stuff will fall out of their head. Finally, there's this weird thing called self-affirmation. It's a social psych term. What it means is that we reinforce something that's of value to the individual before we then give them risk information. Reinforce their connection with the community, reinforce something that's important to them, whether or not it's important to you. That gets them solid in a psychological sense, and then you can go on to give the tough information. The final thing I'm going to give you is a page from a book, 150 Reasons for Disobeying the Vaccination Laws of a Persons Prosecuted Under It. This is from 1878. I can give you other books all the way back to the early 1800s, back to when vaccination started. People have been hating vaccines for 200 years. So this anti-vaccination movement that was so-called started by Wakefield is really not started by Wakefield, and that indeed is started by a whole lot of ways that people think. So we're not going to reach everyone, but we can probably manage this over time in an important way, using, for example, social media as a positive tool, not a negative tool. I'm currently the chair of the National HPV Vaccination Roundtable. And as part of that, we've been trying to intervene in negative narratives about HPV vaccination. So we work with a coalition of about 70 national organizations. We are not a powerful voice on our own. However, they are all powerful voices, so we've tried to work with them collaboratively. Another good example of how to intervene is when you have a large megaphone. So for example, Dr. Lisa Richardson at the CDC, with their Division of Cancer Prevention and Control, has very effectively used Twitter to generate 2 million followers right in that area, and then they communicate about issues of interest. So if you have a large megaphone, you have to use it. If you don't have a large megaphone, get to people who do. In the context of HPV vaccination, there's a steady drumbeat of negative information. We now need to counter that with positive information. Thank you very much.